Chapter 1. A Controlled Burn and the Pimple Mounds. The first thing I remember about the day the trial began was the smell. Not brimstone, not rot, not the usual odors of judgment and state-issued coffee, but smoke. Not fire smoke either. More like an old memory of something burning long before you ever saw it. It was the scent of a controlled burn gone spiritual. Somebody up near Montrose or Lake Village was torching timber to make room for new pines, but it got caught in the wind and blew over the courthouse steps like a biblical omen. My name's Buddy Portis. People around here call me that, even though I'm Charles by birth and Portis by blood. I ain't a lawyer, nor a judge, nor any kind of deity in the traditional sense, but I was appointed the chronicler of this whole ridiculous affair by God himself, who handed me a clipboard and a thermos and told me not to embellish too much. Said he trusted my dry sense of observation more than his own memory. Don't try to fix it, he said. Just write it how it happened, even if it makes me look bad. So I did. Anyway, the trial wasn't about arson or zoning or the kind of thing you'd expect to bring every living philosopher, theologian, and biologist to a one-room courthouse in Ashley County. It was about a possum, or what people thought was a possum. His name was Greg. He was accused of having an unnatural advantage in his reproductive anatomy, specifically a bifurcated penis, which, for those of you who ain't familiar, means it's got two forks like a tuning fork or a snake tongue, except it ain't a metaphor, it's real, and it caused all this trouble. Greg said he was an American monkey, said his kind been around since before Columbus and had a long and proud history of monogamy, selective breeding, and emotional intelligence. Mildred was his mate. Mildred had a bifurcated vagina, which isn't something people like to talk about, but it came up anyway because the biology got dragged into the theology, and the theology had already run off into the philosophical ditch with William Faulkner and Shelby Foote hanging out the windows drinking corn whiskey and quoting Virgil. The judge said he wasn't sure what the case was even about, but that he was willing to let it proceed out of curiosity. Jesus showed up about 30 minutes late, eating a gas station biscuit and already pissed off. He was prosecuting. Said he had notes. Told me to write that he had notes. Then he winked. God was already there. He'd brought 2 folding chairs and a box fan and was sitting in the gallery with a shirt that read, "Shock the Monkey." I asked him about the shirt. "It's a metaphor," he said. "You wouldn't understand." "Try me." "It's about love," he said, and didn't elaborate. So that's where we were. Smoke in the air, pimple mounds just visible through the haze outside, those weird ancient hillocks the earth makes when it's trying to remember being something else. A bunch of people standing around a possum with a forked dick, wondering if he was the future of the species or the end of it. And me, with my clipboard, just trying to keep it all in order.
Chapter 2. The Gospel According to Greg's Penis. Buddy Portis here again. They told me not to start this chapter with genitalia, but seeing as the whole damn trial's built on it, and seeing as I was anointed chronicler by God himself, who, I must say, had a surprisingly authoritarian fashion sense, I figured I'd go ahead and get right to it. Greg's bifurcated penis, forked like the tongue of a Pentecostal snake, was the first and last piece of evidence anyone needed in this trial, depending on who you asked. Now, Greg ain't what you'd call a flashy man. He's a possum, technically, though he prefers the term American monkey, which he swears is more appropriate given his bipedal tendencies, emotional range, and the fact that he can differentiate between RC Cola and Diet Right. Says possum is a slur invented by East Coast elitists who've never walked barefoot through a Waffle House parking lot. He sat on the witness stand in his little denim overalls, tail curled around the leg of the chair for balance, holding a can of Vienna sausages like it was a worry stone. When asked to describe the events leading up to the bifurcation incident, which as far as I can tell happened when he was born that way, he said, and I quote, It's not something I got done like one of them elective surgeries. It's a God's decision. I was born split, like a river that can't decide which way to go. The courtroom was silent, mostly because Shelby Food had fallen asleep again, and Faulkner was chewing on his pipe like it owed him money. Jesus, seated at the co-counsel table, scribbled something in his notebook, something poetic probably, about dualities and sacred geometries of the flesh. The prosecutor, a man named Wendell D. Wick, looked flustered. He'd been trying to build a case against Mildred for moral turpitude on account of her multiple baby daddies and her ambiguous theological alignment, but all his arguments kept leading back to Greg's anatomy, as if that were some kind of proof of divine rebellion. "Would you say," Wendell asked, pushing his glasses up his nose like he was about to deliver a game-winning Jeopardy answer, "that your condition is unnatural?" Greg blinked. "Well," he said, slowly, "it's not something I got done like one of them elective surgeries. It's a God's decision. I was born split, like a river that can't decide which way to go." The courtroom was silent, mostly because Shelby Food had fallen asleep again, and Faulkner was chewing on his pipe like it owed him money. Jesus, seated at the co-counsel table, scribbled something in his notebook, something poetic probably, about dualities and sacred geometries of the flesh. The judge, who had been quiet so far, finally leaned forward and muttered, "And this is the gospel?" That's when I knew this wasn't going to be your regular trial. This was a cosmic inquest wrapped in backwoods logic and soaked in theological moonshine. I flipped open my notebook. God had told me to write it all down exactly as it happened. I asked if I could paraphrase, but he said no, direct quotes only. He said this story would outlive the others. The Gospel of Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, and now, Buddy. So I wrote, Chapter 2, Greg's penis takes the stand. Species, American monkey, self-identified. Exhibit A, bifurcation. Defense argument, divine design plus regional authenticity. Closing thought, if the penis is forked, maybe the path was never meant to be straight. The courtroom sat in silence. Outside, a dog barked. The jury scratched their heads, and Greg, saintly in his own marsupial way, peeled open another Vienna sausage and offered one to God. God declined, said he was watching his cholesterol.
Chapter 3, The Scientist with the Slide Clicker. They wheeled in a rolling cart like it was a damn classroom in 1994. Metal legs, wobbly wheels, little loose cords swinging like a tail. On top sat a projector. Honest to God, slide projector. Had the dust of 1,000 grant rejections on it. The man who brought it in wore a lab coat that had seen better experiments. He said his name was Dr. Philip Mooney from the Federal Bureau of Investigation Bifurcated Genitals Unit, FBI BGU. He showed his badge. It was laminated, looked printed off a Hewlett-Packard. Your Honor, he said, clicking the first slide, I've prepared a brief educational series on marsupial-genital divergence and its implications on divine cosmology. At that moment, Faulkner muttered something about a Mississippi of vaginas, and Shelby Foot started scribbling a battlefield map of the uterus on the back of a Waffle House napkin. I looked around. Judge sat back. Jury leaned forward. Mildred crossed her legs, not because of modesty, but because she was sick of being studied like a holy diagram. Greg was eating a fignon out of a styrofoam cup. Slide 1 clicked up, a possum diagram, bold lines, Latin labels. Dr. Mooney pointed with a laser he borrowed from Office Depot. As you can see, the male reproductive organ is bifurcated, forked, Y-shaped, spiritually misunderstood. Each side corresponds to one of the female's mirrored chambers. Shelby whispered to Bill, like a key and a double lock. Bill said, like a drunk trying to parallel park. Slide 2, a historic drawing. Some medieval monk's rendering of a possum, labeled Daemonis vulgaris. Historically, Mooney continued, bifurcation has been mistaken as demonic influence, but in truth, It is simply marsupial evolution. Slide 3, a chart. Evolutionary branches. The possum off to the side like a mistake. Many ask, why bifurcated genitals? The answer, redundancy and specialization. The same reason God made 2 lungs and a backup liver. Greg coughed once, said, ain't nothing wrong with having options. That got a chuckle. Even the stenographer broke a rhythm. Dr. Mooney clicked to slide 4. Now this is where things get contentious. A photograph. It was Mildred, taken in the woods, blurry, unflattering. From the angle, you could tell it was snapped without consent. Objection came fast and loud. Mildred's lawyer stood up with righteous rage and a slight barbecue stain on his tie. Your Honor, this is nothing short of biological pornography. Greg stood. Y'all don't get to look at my wife's situation unless she says so, or unless Jesus himself says it's okay. Judge rubbed his temples, said, Dr. Mooney, remove the photo. This is a courtroom, not a peep show for theological perverts. Click, slide gone. Dr. Mooney apologized, said it was for academic purposes, that he also had been raised Southern Baptist and understood discretion, though his tone said otherwise. Final point, he added. Click. Last slide. A Venn diagram. One circle said possum reproduction. The other, theological dissonance. In the middle, this trial. And for once, nobody laughed. It was the only time it felt like everybody in that room understood exactly what was happening. They weren't just trying Greg and Mildred. They was trying to figure out what kind of God would design a possum like this, then toss it into America and call it a monkey. Court recessed for lunch. Shelby Foote tried to order a gin and tonic from the vending machine. Faulkner had already disappeared, muttering something about sawdust and the soul. I sat there, eating a moon pie, thinking about God's strange designs, thinking how 2 forks ain't so bad if you're trying to eat off of 2 plates. It just depends on what you're hungry for.
Chapter 4, The Cross-Examination of Greg, Part 1. Now, Greg, he ain't a practiced speaker. You can tell that right away. But once he got up on the witness stand, scratched once behind his ear, adjusted himself, and stared out into the courtroom with those small, night-seeing eyes, the whole place tensed up like they was watching a local weatherman predict a tornado. He began his testimony the only way he knew how. I ain't done nothing wrong, not morally, not biologically, not even geographically. I just loved Mildred. And there it was, the full-hearted confession of a creature whose penis was shaped like a barbecue fork and whose wife's genitals, according to experts and amateurs alike, resembled a particularly confusing topographical map of the Ozarks. Greg had been instructed to speak plainly, but he had his own script. Said he wrote it on the back of a gas station receipt. Said inspiration struck him while watching a man in a wheelchair buy scratch-offs and a Slim Jim. The prosecutor, some smooth-voiced fella from Baton Rouge, stood up, slicked his hair back with his palm, and asked the opening question. Greg, do you understand what monogamy means? Greg blinked once. Yeah, means you only get bifurcated with one woman. There was a long pause. Even the stenographer typed that twice just to make sure. The prosecutor tried again. So you're saying you've only, used both sides on Mildred? Greg narrowed his eyes. Ain't none of y'all's business how I parallel park my love. Faulkner, who had somehow procured a folding fan from somewhere beneath the witness bench, fanned himself and whispered, "This here is biblical." Shelby Fruit nodded and scratched double-entry marsupial accountant in the margins of his notepad. The prosecutor kept pressing. Greg, you refer to yourself as an American monkey, yet scientifically you are a possum. Greg nodded. That's true, but I live free. I sleep in the attic sometimes. I eat grapes out of the trash can behind the Waffle House. I stand upright when I need to, and I once played dead during a family reunion so convincingly they buried me in a styrofoam cooler for 3 days. If that ain't American, I don't know what is. I took that down in my notes. It wasn't helpful, but it felt honest. Then came the kicker. Greg, the prosecutor said, stepping forward like a preacher about to condemn a bass guitarist, are you aware that your anatomy was submitted as evidence in the case against God? You could feel the hush settle. Greg nodded slow. I heard that. Heard they say my penis is theological. They do. And they say it proves God ain't perfect? That is the assertion. Greg scratched his belly, leaned into the mic like he was giving advice to an old friend. Well, far as I know, God made crawdads with claws, snakes with no legs, and armadillos that looked like an armored football. If he messed up on my junk, maybe that's just part of his big idea. I don't know. I just know I love Mildred. And when I got both sides going right, it feels like church. Somewhere in the courtroom, someone whispered, Amen. Might have been the bailiff. Might have been Faulkner. Could have been me. The judge banged his gavel. That's enough for now. We'll resume this cross-examination after we've all had time to, reflect. And so the court recessed again. Greg stepped down. He was offered a small peach soda and a little tray of those butter cookies that come in tins filled with sewing supplies. Mildred wiped her eyes with a damp Kroger receipt. And I, the chronicler, looked around this holy circus and thought, we are in trouble. And trouble, when properly forked, runs deep.
Chapter 5. Mildred takes the stand in her own way. Now, I've been around women of various convictions, snake handlers, mimes, junior college professors, but I can say with confidence that Mildred was the first female possum I've seen that walked into a courtroom like it was her second job and her first husband was buried under it. They brought her in gently in a zippered vinyl carrier with a lavender ribbon on the handle. Someone had piped in a little Enya on a Bluetooth speaker. Jesus' idea, I believe. He said she needed space to feel. Everyone ignored that. When the bailiff unzipped the bag, she climbed out slow and deliberate, dragging her tail behind her like a protest banner. The prosecutor stood, holding what looked like a clipboard, but was in fact a laminated Waffle House menu with questions scribbled on the back. He adjusted his tie, which was a little too thin for someone trying to cross-examine a marsupial in a public forum. Now, Miss Mildred, he began, and she blinked once. May I ask you a few questions about your relationship with Greg? She reached into her pouch and retrieved a pencil. No one knew how the pencil got there. I chose not to ask. Then she tapped it once on the stand. Yes, she said, and yes, she spoke. Faulkner let out a low whistle. Shelby, who'd brought a thermos labeled cold tomato whiskey, wrote, Babel repeats itself. You and Greg have been romantically involved for how long? The prosecutor asked. 7 years, or 2 possum decades. We count time different. There's more suffering. You describe your relationship as sacramental, despite the anatomy. Now, I need to pause here for the record and note this is where the courtroom got noticeably warm. Not spiritually warm, just physically overheated. Some blame the HVAC system. Others blame the metaphysical presence of God's shame. I don't know which is truer. I had sweat rings on my paper. Miss Mildred, the prosecutor went on, do you feel you were ever coerced into this relationship? She sighed. No, but I have felt examined, objectified.
There are entire theological threads written about my reproductive tract. I did not ask for that. Do you mind elaborating? Well, consider this. I was raised behind the Hardys. I did not dream of this moment, being asked in a courtroom full of drunk Southern novelists and minor deities to justify my bifurcation. At this, Jesus scribbled something on a napkin. Looked like a poem. Might have been a grocery list. Mildred continued, Every time I step into this courtroom, someone wants to peek inside me, metaphorically or otherwise. They say it's science or religion or anthropology. I call it voyeurism with a diploma. Even the stenographer cleared her throat. Do you say you love Greg? More than most things, less than fresh peaches. Would you say he respects you? He does not understand me, but he respects me. And do you feel that your bifurcation has contributed to or complicated your union? Mildred gave him a look, not mean, just long, like she was trying to decide whether to answer or chew gum. It's just how I'm built, she said. It ain't poetry, it's plumbing. I wrote that down. It's one of the truest things said in that courtroom. After a moment, she looked over at Greg. He gave her a thumbs up with his claw. She rolled her eyes and blushed in the marsupial way, which is to say, she licked the paw and smoothed the fur on her snout. I didn't ask to be the vessel of your metaphysical reckoning, she said, now looking directly at the jury. But if my anatomy has to bear the weight of your meaning, then let it. Just remember I also like figs, sleeping in drawers, and the smell of burnt coffee. I'm not a metaphor, I'm Mildred. With that, she climbed back into her carrier. Court recessed for a full hour. God left the room. So did Bill and Shelby, though they were spotted in the Minden area arguing over whether pork rinds count as communion wafers in Arkansas. The judge wrote something in his notepad that he later claimed was a prayer, but looked suspiciously like a lunch order. And I, as always, observed, because I am the chronicler. And the possum just testified.
Chapter 6, The Vending Machine Symposium. After Mildred's testimony, which left the courtroom somewhere between stunned and spiritually exfoliated, Judge Rawson called for recess. Nobody argued. The air was heavy. The Holy Ghost had taken the form of a damp draft under the door. The bailiff's hair had grayed in real time. And so the courtroom emptied. More drifted, really, toward the only place that promised comfort and artificial sweetness, the vending area. Let me be clear. This was not some opulent courthouse cafe. This was a tiled alcove with 2 vending machines, a broken water fountain, and a bulletin board that had not been updated since Arkansas voted against time zones. Yet it became, in those next 47 minutes, the site of what I now refer to as the Vending Machine Symposium. God, in his fatherly wrath, did not show, said he had to go walk and cool off. Jesus showed up late, carrying a Diet Dr. Pepper and a bag of Smart Food popcorn, which he claimed was a Eucharist of the enlightened gut. Faulkner and Shelby Foote were already there, of course, sitting cross-legged on the floor like Civil War reenactors on ketamine. They'd formed a loose circle with 3 other beings, a court clerk with one eye that didn't track right, a folklorist from Helena wearing a bolo tie that said Yakna Pata or Bust, and Greg, who'd somehow convinced someone to let him out of his carrier again. Greg sat upright, like a wise but fidgety child. His tail had coiled around a sleeve of saltines like a security blanket. Shelby was holding court. "Look," he said, waving a Rice Krispie treat, "the problem with the entire case is interpretive. We're treating bifurcation as a deviation, when in fact it may be the original state of things. Adam and Eve both may have had 2 of everything. It was a snake who streamlined the whole affair." Faulkner was not impressed.
That's myth, not literature. And this is literature disguised as myth, disguised as a public health concern, he said, then took a swig from a plastic bottle labeled tomato whiskey. Do not drink unless godless. Jesus leaned in. Did either of you read my notes from the Beatitudes? There's a whole section I had to cut out about reproductive multiplicity. The crowd wasn't ready. Greg raised his hand. Is it true that heaven doesn't have vending machines? Jesus looked genuinely sad. That's true. They keep everything in jars, and most of it's from the 1970s. There was a silence then, long enough for the court clerk to unwrap a payday bar and say, This all seems symbolic, but I don't know what of. Shelby tapped the glass of the vending machine. You know what I see in here? Power structures, a grid of inaccessible goods, the whole cosmos trapped behind lexicon. Faulkner snorted. You just want funyuns. I'm making a metaphor. The salty air of discontent is the flavor of narrative tension. Greg stood, holding a pack of crackers like it was Exhibit B. If you people don't quit talking in riddles, I'm going to show everyone my penis again. There was some light clapping from the folklorist. And then Jesus, calmly, placed his popcorn on top of the vending machine, held up a Slim Jim and said, This is my body. It's made with mechanically separated chicken and spiritual implication. Nobody moved. The Slim Jim, dangling like a snake with a doctorate in comparative religion, somehow felt like the key to all this. It was at that moment the bailiff came in, holding a clipboard and chewing something that sounded like anger and bazooka gum. Court reconvenes in 10 minutes, and the judge says if anyone tries to speak in metaphor again, he's going to hold the Holy Ghost in contempt. Everyone nodded solemnly, even Greg. They filed out single file, Shelby trying to pocket a honey bun without it looking like a theological act. Faulkner lit a pipe that smelled like regret. Jesus finished the popcorn and muttered something about reincarnating as a squirrel if this didn't go well. And I, Buddy Portis, followed them all back to court, because I have to. I'm the chronicler, I have the notes, I have the clearance, and I have a Chex Mix loyalty card, because unlike the Holy Trinity, I am very much a creature of habit.
Chapter 7, The Great Opening Statement Fiasco. They say every good trial begins with an opening statement. They also say possums can't form long-term pair bonds, but Greg and Mildred seem determined to disprove that too, one bifurcated cuddle at a time. Court came back from recess like an old dog coming out of sedation. Folks still had vending machine glaze in their eyes. You could smell the vending symposium clinging to everyone. Popcorn dust, honey bun icing, the holy funk of Slim Jims. Judge Rawson came back in wearing his robe like a cape, which he insisted was just a mood. That's when the prosecution called God to deliver his opening statement. Now, in most judicial environments, having the creator of the universe deliver your opening arguments would be seen as a strategic advantage, but not in this courtroom. Not today. God stepped up to the podium, cleared his throat, and said, Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, and also Faulkner, whose presence is somehow extrajudicial. He paused, as if searching for a legal precedent that didn't involve plagues or talking donkeys. We are here because of sin, not the sexy kind, not the good old-fashioned Sodom and Gomorrah kind either. No, this is marsupial sin, possum sin, southern sin. It's subtle, and it smells like old hay and unresolved trauma. Shelby Foote nodded, possibly in agreement or just because he'd been dozing with his eyes open. God pressed on. What I'm trying to say is that this situation is not natural. I don't care how many uteri you pack into a marsupial, there are limits. If bifurcation is acceptable, what's next? Quadruplication? Tentacles? Polyamorous raccoons? At this, one juror scribbled a note that simply read,
Would raccoons form unions? I saw it. I'm the chronicler. Jesus, who'd been polishing his Birkenstocks with a sleeve, leaned over to whisper something to his defense counsel, a lapsed monk with a skateboard and a law degree from Pepperdine. The monk wrote down, "Remind me to mention Matthew 5:9 and mention Greg's inner gentleness." Meanwhile, God was picking up steam. And as for this so-called salad, he gestured at the evidence table, where a sad wooden bowl sat, filled with romaine, strawberries, walnuts, and something approximating cheese. This is not the Garden of Eden. This is a Pinterest sin. He slammed his hand on the podium. It thundered, literally. This trial is not just about genitals. It's about rebellion. Rebellion in miniature. Rebellion with whiskers. And if we allow this, if we condone this unholy anatomy, then the next thing you know, Jesus will be wearing my shirt and quoting Kierkegaard at gas stations. Which, incidentally, had already happened. I seen it. I'm the chronicler. The courtroom was dead silent. Then Faulkner coughed and muttered, "Damn fine shirt, though." Jesus smiled faintly. And God, realizing perhaps he'd oversold his point, quietly sat down. He fumbled with his robe, which had somehow snagged on a binder labeled "Subpoena the Holy Spirit." Shelby Foote leaned over to Faulkner and whispered, "I think he lost the jury at polyamorous raccoons." And Faulkner replied, "No, he lost 'em when he disrespected the salad." Mildred uncrossed her legs with dignity. Greg scratched behind his ear and looked existential. And I, Charles Buddy Portis, took a sip from my courthouse-approved thermos and wrote this all down in my notebook marked Chapter 7, The Great Opening Statement Fiasco. If this is divine litigation, we're going to need more vending machines. Chapter 8, in which Jesus attempts cross-examination and accidentally invents method acting. I ain't ever seen a Nazarene sweat like that. Court was back in full swing after God's fire and brimstone opening fizzled like a wet sparkler in a thunderstorm. The gallery still stank of vending machine chili and theological panic. The judge was polishing his gavel with what looked like lemon pledge and conviction. Greg and Mildred, the defendant/marsupials, were curled together under a courthouse-issued thermal blanket, watching the proceedings with a disinterest typically reserved for taxidermy. And that's when Jesus Christ asked to perform the first cross-examination. I ain't making this up. He raised his hand like a middle schooler needing to tinkle, stood up in his sandals, and walked calmly to the center of the courtroom, his father's robe billowing slightly behind him. Yes, he was still wearing God's shirt. Yes, it still said "Shock the Monkey." No one mentioned it anymore. We were all too deep in. The judge nodded without speaking, possibly out of fear, possibly out of confusion. Jesus cleared his throat. "Your Honor, I would like to call my first witness, Greg." There was a pause. Greg looked up, blinked both of his eyes out of sync, and waddled to the stand. Let me say this much. Seeing a possum try to adjust a necktie is something you don't forget, nor do you forgive it. He climbed a little ladder someone thoughtfully installed for him, perched atop the witness chair like a squirrel on a mailbox, and waited. Tail wrapped around the bar like it had something to say. Jesus approached slowly, like he was rehearsing a scene from a play he hadn't written yet. "Greg, do you love Mildred?" Greg opened his mouth, but nothing came out but a kind of wet whistle. Jesus turned to the jury. "You see, that right there is a sound of restraint, a sound of dignity. That is what love sounds like when it is made awkward by man's labels, by God's taxonomy." There was murmuring. The stenographer wrote down "possum babble." Jesus walked back and forth, slowly. You could tell he was feeling the room. "Now I ask you, is it sin or is it just Southern biology? I mean, Greg didn't choose bifurcation. Mildred didn't special order a dual uterus system on Etsy. This is not a crime. This is nature's back road detour." Faulkner from the gallery muttered, "That sounds like a line I forgot to write down once." Jesus ignored him and picked up a diagram. It was a rough sketch of Greg's anatomy, drawn in highlighter and labeled "forked like a river, not a fork." "This is what we're afraid of? This is why we're here? Because Greg's got 2 lanes in his love highway? Meanwhile, y'all let raccoons run wild through your attics and nobody raises a goddamn moral fuss." The judge banged his gavel. "Watch the language." "Sorry, Dad," Jesus said reflexively. It got weird for a moment. He turned back to Greg. "Tell me, Greg, have you ever forced Mildred into anything she didn't want?" Greg blinked again, solemnly. One eye, then the other. Then he took 1 peanut from his pouch and placed it gently on the witness stand. That peanut said more than most confessions I ever heard. Jesus turned back to the court. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, I rest my case. Let love be. Let forked love be forked." He walked back to the defense table like he'd just finished a particularly poetic interpretive dance. Mildred blinked tears, or maybe she had an allergy. Shelby Foote leaned over to Faulkner and whispered, "That boy missed his calling. Should have been a preacher." Faulkner responded, "He was." The judge called for a 10-minute recess so everyone could reflect on the peanut and perhaps their own inner bifurcations. I, Charles Buddy Portis, simply wrote this all down and tried not to laugh. That was Chapter 8, in which Jesus attempts cross-examination and accidentally invents method acting. Tomorrow, Shelby takes the stand. Faulkner provides interpretive dance. The bailiff quits in protest. Mildred says something nobody was ready for. Stay tuned. This trial ain't done. It's barely begun. Chapter 9, in which Shelby Foote testifies and absolutely nobody wins. Now there comes a point in every trial where things begin to slip. Not because of a miscarriage of justice or a surprise witness or divine lightning crackling across the defense table, but because you let too many riders into the building without adult supervision. That point was reached at 10:41 a.m. on day 3 of the trial, when Shelby Foote took the stand with a pipe in his mouth, a stack of his own books in his lap, and a profound misunderstanding of the legal process in his heart. "Would you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?" the bailiff asked. "I will swear it in the style of the antebellum South," Shelby replied. We were already in trouble. Shelby began by rearranging the books around him like sandbags in a flood. The jury, already ragged from Jesus' cross-examination the day before, was squinting in that particular way jurors do when they realize they not going to understand a damn word of what comes next. He cleared his throat, and in that slow southern drawl that dragged out vowels like fresh laundry across a clothesline, he began. Now the matter before this most venerable and perhaps divinely mocked court is not merely that of a possum with bifurcated genitalia, though Lord knows that'd be enough to try the patience of Job, but rather of the cultural weight borne by such an anatomical arrangement. The stenographer sighed audibly. She had already asked for hazard pay. Shelby continued, undeterred by the yawns or the dull third of the judge's head on the bench. Now, I don't know if it's appropriate to compare Greg to Stonewall Jackson, but I done it anyway, and what can you do about it? This was not a question. It was a dare. In the gallery, Faulkner clapped twice, then opened a bottle of something labeled "Old Forward." Shelby, not missing a beat, pulled out a page of handwritten notes. It reads, "Shelby, if they ask you about the monkey possum again, remember, truth is not a straight road. It is a long, winding draw through kudzu-choked swamps of maybe." The jury had begun playing hangman on the back of their court-issued note cards. Greg, meanwhile, had fallen asleep in Mildred's lap, both of them unaware, or perfectly aware, that Shelby was now comparing their mating habits to the strategic movements of General Beauregard in the Second Battle of Corinth. The possum is a tactician. He waits, he watches, he forks when the moment demands forking. We could all learn from him. This elicited a collective groan from the peanut gallery. Jesus, sitting at the defense table, buried his face in his hands. Even the Son of God couldn't figure out how we'd arrived at this moment. Shelby was still going. "And so, Your Honor, I submit that these possums are not just creatures. They are metaphors. They are testaments. They are the Delta come to life, slinking and scratching and making their own damn way through the world." At this point, somebody in the audience shouted, "This ain't Ken Burns." The judge banged the gavel. It sounded like a mosquito hitting a screen door. Shelby finally stepped down from the stand. He left behind 2 pipe cleaners, a yellowed envelope, and a piece of chalk, the meaning of which would never be explained. I, Charles Buddy Portis, scribbled it all down, every damn syllable. I did not enjoy doing so, but as I've said before, a job is a job, even when it feels like community service for sins I can't remember committing. That was Chapter 9, in which Shelby Foote testifies and absolutely nobody wins. Tomorrow, Faulkner tries to out-testify Shelby using only facial expressions and a live chicken. Greg develops a fascination with vending machines, and the jurors stage a mild coup. Chapter 10. Faulkner takes the stand and immediately regrets it. I've been asked, by heaven apparently, to record the truth of this trial. So let me say, with no exaggeration, that what followed Shelby's testimony was something between a seance, a carnival act, and the third act of a Tennessee Williams play left too long in the sun. William Faulkner, introduced to the court by his own echo, took the stand at 1:47 p.m. He arrived barefoot. He wore a bathrobe which had been monogrammed, incorrectly, with the initials R.E. Lee. He carried with him a chicken, alive. Now, I have seen many strange things in Ashley County courtrooms. There was the man who tried to plead temporary insanity because his goat had bitten him in a religious way. There was the woman who attempted to marry a cement mixer. But never before had a Pulitzer Prize-winning author entered a courthouse cradling a Rhode Island red and referring to it as "my soul's projection." He said, the robe flared dramatically like a curtain being drawn back on the apocalypse. The chicken squawked once to assert its agency. "State your name for the record," the judge said, already halfway to a headache. "Bill," he said, or the ghost of Bill, depending on your belief in literary continuity. "And your last name?" "Irrelevant, but Faulkner, if you insist." This was the man sworn to testify on behalf of God. "And do you swear to tell the truth?" "Not a chance in hell," he muttered, "but I'll say the truest things I know, which is better." Greg, still seated with Mildred in their little wooden enclosure that resembled a beaver dam designed by a depressed architect, appeared to be visibly nervous. I say appeared because I cannot speak to a possum's internal state with certainty, only translate it through the gift God has given me. And Greg was thinking, Why is that man holding a chicken like it's his diary? Faulkner began. These creatures, he said, are not simply the residue of creation. They are the failed drafts, the footnotes, God's parentheses. Greg and Mildred are quite literally what happens when a deity edits too late. The chicken blinked. You see, he's went on, his voice catching like a rusted hinge. It's all about the bifurcation, a metaphor, a forked road, a yes and a no that can never reconcile. It is the South. It is history. It is my Uncle Willie's family reunion where two cousins married and still won't talk about it. Objection, cried the prosecuting attorney. Sustained, although that last part was compelling. Faulkner turned on the prosecutor with the theatrical rage of a man who hadn't been edited since 1947. You, sir, would deny the cosmic significance of marsupial mating mechanics? Yes. Then you are unworthy of your shoes, Faulkner declared. The judge asked if that was a threat. It was not. It was just Faulkner. Now, a man can only stand so much Faulkner. Most people have to take the sound in the fury in small doses, preferably with bourbon. But Faulkner himself is undiluted, and by 2:15 p.m. the court had entered what we now refer to as the recursive hour. Greg is not just a possum. He is time. He is the South's subconscious. He is every failed man who ever hung upside down and hoped for grace. Sir, are you speaking metaphorically or literally? Both, said Faulkner. Also, this chicken is God. That's when the bailiff tried to remove him from the stand, and the chicken panicked and laid an egg directly onto Exhibit D, a small photograph of Greg's bifurcated penis, printed on cardstock. Shelby Foote wept quietly in the gallery. Jesus whispered something to the Holy Ghost, who shook his head and refused to make eye contact. The egg is truth, Faulkner said. He left the courtroom under mild protest. The chicken remained, officially entered into evidence as Item P, unconfirmed divine projection. I, Charles Buddy Portis, chronicler by judicial accident and divine mischief, wrote it all down. The chicken, the robe, the egg on the photograph. I wish I hadn't, but the contract is binding, and so here we are.
Chapter 11. The FBI BGU presents its findings. Now, courtrooms have certain rhythms. You got your drama, your lulls, your coffee breaks that stretch a little too long depending on how bad the vending machine is. But today's rhythm changed when the lights dimmed, a projector screen descended from the ceiling like the veil in a bad Baptist Easter pageant, and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, Bifurcated Genitals Unit, FBI BGU, took the floor. This subunit had been formed, I was told, after several congressional hearings into the taxonomical anomalies of American fauna and their potential theological implications. It had 3 agents, one zoologist, one linguist, and one man who just wouldn't leave. Agent Cheryl Denton stepped up first. She was what I would call post-patient, the kind of person who has answered the same question about possum penises at least 100 times too many. She clicked a little remote. Slide 1, Marsupial Reproductive Morphology, Implications for Divine Design. Ladies and gentlemen of the court, she began, adjusting her glasses with a sigh, we are gathered here today to scientifically and without shame discuss the bifurcated nature of opossum genitalia and whether or not this was a clerical error on God's part. Faulkner in the gallery chuckled audibly. I told you it was metaphor, he muttered, swilling what smelled suspiciously like gin in a communion cup. Slide 2. A high-resolution image of Greg's anatomy. Greg blushed and tried to sit behind Mildred. As you can see, Denton continued, the male opossum, or Didelphis virginiana, possesses a penis that forks at the end. This is not aberration. This is nature. Jesus scribbled in his notebook. Not aberration equals intention.
Compare to Matthew 5:27. Revisit. Slide 3. A diagram of the female anatomy. Mildred let out a small squeak of protest. The female likewise has 2 lateral vaginas and a central birth canal. This structure allows for dual fertilization pathways and is believed to be optimized for reproductive success in the wild. The prosecutor raised a hand. Are you saying this is advantageous? Sir, I'm saying the bifurcated model is both functional and apparently beautiful, at least according to poetry submitted in Exhibit H by Mr. Greg. Greg nodded solemnly. Mildred looked away. Slide 4. Cultural implications. This one showed cave drawings, medieval sketches, and a screenshot from a fringe theology thread titled, "Is God Forked?" Agent Denton cleared her throat. We believe, she said, that the bifurcation has been spiritually misunderstood. It is not perversion, it is plurality. It is a divine echo. It is... She was cut off by the second agent, linguist Dr. Floyd Halliburton, who stormed forward to the microphone sweating profusely. Bifurcated language, he shouted, startling the chicken. The Bible is full of it. Duality, forked meanings, Jacob and Esau, Cain and Abel, law and grace, milk and meat, penis and more penis. The judge slammed his gavel. That's enough penis out of you today, doctor. But it wasn't over, because agent number 3, the one who wouldn't leave, stood up, rolled a whiteboard in from the hallway, and began drawing diagrams with the speed and abandon of a man who had not been allowed near dry erase markers for years. My name is Clint, and this is where it gets quantum. He drew what I can only describe as a bifurcated flowchart of cause, effect, and divine intent. It looked like if a spaghetti dinner had a nervous breakdown. This, he said, stabbing at the board, proves that every divine choice forks, just like Greg. God himself is bifurcated. Otherwise, explain Leviticus and the Sermon on the Mount. There was silence, except from Jesus, who muttered, "That's actually not too bad." The judge allowed the chicken to peck at a vote button. It lit up green. Motion to admit the FBI BGU's testimony as credible, the clerk announced, confused. That's when Greg, for the first time, stood up, tail straight, eyes serious. He tugged on his little courtroom vest and said, "I'd like to file an emotional damages complaint, not just for the pictures, but for the assumption that my anatomy is somehow a joke." Mildred nodded solemnly. The court did not laugh. And in that moment, I realized the absurdity had become sincere. Somewhere in the PowerPoint, somewhere between divine design and possum desire, this courtroom had stopped being a farce and started to feel like a reckoning. I, Buddy Portis, wrote it down in my little pad. Chapter 11, The Government Admits the Genitals Are Real. And I added a little note for myself. Buy more ink. This trial isn't halfway done.